Good morning, everyone. How are folks doing? Awake? Jazzed? Hopefully everyone had some time to decompress after what I'm sure was a very full day for everybody yesterday, and are ready to get into it again this morning. My name is Jane Malalfa. My pronouns are they, them, and I'm a member of the Women's National Housing and Homelessness Network, and I will be your moderator today. Our panel is gender-based violence and homelessness, and our panelists are going to answer or question where we go from now. We'll have two sessions or two papers, so we'll actually be able to have some time for discussion. So we'll have two 30-minute presentations followed by a Q&A, where I will encourage all of your opinions and questions respectfully. And I will throw it over to our first group then, supporting tenants experiencing gender-based violence.
Hi, so good morning, everybody. So thank you for joining us today to learn about a new housing legal service for tenants experiencing gender-based violence. I'm one of the presenters. My name is Michelle Che. I'm a lawyer at the Advocacy Center for Tenants Ontario. My pronouns are she, her. Joining me is my colleague and project co-lead, Karen Harvey. Pronouns are also she, her, and she is a social worker. And then from WomanACT is Dichle Han. Pronouns are she, her, and she is a policy and research manager. Okay. So before getting started, we just want to begin with a land acknowledgement from where we come from and where we have traveled. So we acknowledge that ACTO and WomanACT have offices located in Toronto. The sacred land is the traditional territory of many nations, including the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Anishinaabeg, the Chippewa, the Haudenosaunee, and the Wendat peoples, and is now home to many diverse First Nations, Inuit, and Métis peoples. We also acknowledge that Toronto is covered by Treaty 13 and the Williams Treaties. We acknowledge that the Canadian government has pursued a policy of cultural genocide to divest itself of its legal and financial obligations to Indigenous peoples and gain control over their land and resources, and that colonial law is one of the mechanisms used to do so. As settlers working in social work, law, and research, we are situated within this colonial Canadian legal context. We are mindful of the harmful impact of our respective professions in implementing policies that led to land dispossession, the denial of human rights, and the breakdown of communities and families. These colonial acts are at the root of the disproportionate rates of violence inflicted on Indigenous women and girls and gender-diverse peoples. We're mindful of the 2015 Truth and Reconciliation Commission's call to action and the calls for justice outlined in the final report on the National Inquiry into Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women and Girls to redress the legacy and impacts on Indigenous families and communities. We acknowledge the call to action to abandon the colonial policies of the past, address colonial legacies, and to engage in a process of reconciliation with Indigenous peoples of Canada. So this is a little roadmap of what we're going to discuss today. First, we're going to begin by introducing ourselves and our respective projects, and then situate our work in the Ontario housing and legal context. We'll also discuss the unique housing challenges faced by survivors and introduce ACTO's new specialized housing legal service. And then to conclude, Dichle from WomanACT will join us to introduce the Safe at Home project. So Karen and I are here from ACTO. We're a specialty housing legal clinic and advancing the rights of low-income tenants in Ontario. ACTO's mandate includes providing legal advice and representation, law reform, community organizing, and education. We also provide free summary legal advice for self-represented tenants at the Landlord and Tenant Board, which is the tribunal in Ontario that deals with all disputes revolving residential tenancies through our Tenant Duty Council program.
Hi, and WomanACT is a charitable organization with a membership of organizations and individuals working collaboratively to end violence against women through system change. And we do this through research, education, and advocacy.
So we think a lot about the kind of language that we use. So today we want to begin with some important terminology that we'll be using throughout the presentation. So gender-based violence refers to the violence that women, girls, and gender-diverse individuals face disproportionately because of their gender identity or expression, perceived gender, and/or sexuality. It contextualizes the various forms of violence within structural power dynamics. Throughout this presentation, we'll be referring to it as GBV. Victim to survivor are terms used for individuals who have experienced violence. When working with this population, it's important to lead with a term that feels most comfortable for the individual, as we must respect that this might change over time. Although the term survivor is often preferred, as it is more empowering, the term victim also acknowledges the harm done, and as well as those who have been lost to violence. We will also be using the term survivor in this presentation. Perpetrator, or the person causing harm, are terms used to describe someone who is being abusive and can include partners, ex-partners, family, caregivers, landlords, roommates, and strangers. And in this presentation, we'll be using the term perpetrator.
So in response to a reported 30% increase in GBV during the pandemic, the Department of Justice granted ACTO, along with 8 other legal clinics, some funding to expand and enhance their services to better support survivors. Together, we named the collaborative project Your Way Forward, and we work together to help survivors with family, criminal, and housing legal issues. All of our work is evaluated by the Center for Research and Education on Violence Against Women and Children, which is also known as CREVOC. So for ACTO, this funding was a really welcome opportunity to support tenants experiencing GBV with their housing legal issues. But before just launching into a new service, we wanted to better understand survivors' long-term housing journey. And we also wanted to make sure that we were actually providing a service that was needed and that we weren't going to replicate services that already exist. So we started our research with the research question, how do survivors of GBV experience the process of securing and maintaining permanent housing in Ontario? And we looked at that through the housing legal and housing services context. Our study was split into 3 phases. First, we did a lit review just to understand some of the issues. We were really excited to meet some of the people who we cited and really excited to contribute to what's already an amazing body of work. We then did Michelle did a jurisdictional scan where she looked at all of the residential tenancy and social housing legislation across all provinces and territories. And then finally, we identified gaps and barriers for survivors who were accessing and trying to maintain their housing. We did so by interviewing about 80 different key informants. Those were people with lived experience and service professionals. And we triangulated our research with service provider surveys where we had about 120 responses. And I'm going to go rogue for just 1 second because we actually lost one of our participants in the summer. She was really, really young, and she was amazing. She really, really believed in social justice. She lived and breathed it, and I think that anybody who crossed her path really benefited from the help that she gave them. We not only talked to her as a research participant, she actually consulted with us when we've had cases. She's amazing, and I think in a space like this, and a conference like this, it's really important to acknowledge the people that's come before us. And I think everybody here probably has that kind of spirit and speaks from the heart, and like really cares about these issues. So I just kind of want to give a round of applause to her and then all of you. So as a provincial legal clinic, it was important for us to hear stories from people all over Ontario. The dots on the map illustrate all the different people that we talked to, from Moosonee all the way down to Windsor, and from Kenora all the way along to Ottawa. We were really trying to capture some of the differences and nuance between Northern and Southern Ontario, as well as rural and urban Ontario. Oh, give me 1 second, I lost my place. So we're going to give a brief overview of the typical housing journey for survivors in Ontario to provide the context in which we're going to be providing our legal services. So we know from research conducted by our friends at WomanACT that 80% of survivors have to leave home after experiencing violence. And then after leaving, they navigate through many different housing options all along what's known as the housing continuum, from homelessness all the way to private market rent. However, coming through in our research is that this housing continuum in Ontario in 2023 is less like a forward-moving sequence and more like a traffic jam. Survivors are stuck at every stage on this continuum, and some are even moving backwards or cycling through it in this non-stop loop. Home ownership is not even a possibility. So first off is homelessness. After leaving, survivors most often stay with friends and family. We also heard that people take shelter in hotels, cars, garages, even sheds. and this is known as hidden homelessness. Although there's a lack of concrete data on the prevalence of visible homelessness, current counts definitely show an increase in encampments. We heard from our service providers that they knew of pregnant women who had left and had to go live in a tent. We also heard of Indigenous women in the rural north opting to live in pretty notoriously dangerous encampments rather than deal with racism and the emergency shelter system. Many survivors, of course, have to access the emergency shelter system in their housing journey. For those who did manage to get a spot, we heard how busy and stretched thin the service professionals were. We also heard a lot of stories about bullying and discrimination, and sometimes that the only spaces available for those with disabilities were completely inaccessible. We heard from providers that the lack of affordable housing options have caused emergency shelters to operate at capacity, which led to extended stays, which led to survivors having to be turned away from the spaces that they desperately needed. Although GBV shelters were granted pandemic funding to help with this increased demand that I mentioned, it has since been cut. The stress of having nowhere to go was described by one survivor to us as trying to run past a swinging sword. Transitional housing is temporary housing for about 1 to 2 years, and that's for people who are transitioning from emergency shelters into permanent housing. And unlike emergency shelters, survivors don't have that extreme stress of trying to find a place within maybe a couple of weeks. The survivors that we interviewed stated that it actually felt like winning the lottery when they got a space in transitional shelters because they got some more time as well to work through some trauma with support of trained professionals. Although survivors have better outcomes and are more likely to achieve long-term housing stability, Ontario does not provide any core funding to run them. So as such, there's a severe lack of it, and especially in northern and rural communities. Supportive housing is permanent housing with integrated services, varied for each resident depending on their need. Similar to transitional housing, supportive housing has shown to improve long-term housing stability. However, demand for the space is high, and there are long wait lists. Service providers, again, shared with us how floored they were that over the last few years, especially through the pandemic, that there's been an increase in survivors who have very complex needs and complex trauma. Without access to services like supportive housing, the system is now acting like, well, I don't know if now, the system is acting like a revolving door. And notably, there's no specialized supportive services for survivors in Ontario. After leaving, many low-income survivors will also move into publicly funded social housing via the Special Priority Program, or SPP. This is a program that fast-tracks survivors experiencing trafficking or domestic violence to the front of the social housing waitlist. However, after years of underfunding, social housing units are also scarce, with some regions reporting waitlists of over 81,000 people. One survivor told us that they had waited over 3 years and they actually had SPP. Oh, and sorry, one more thing. Ontario's also moved to a choice-based system to streamline these massive wait lists. From our research, we heard that the name is misleading because although the system allows people to select units they're interested in, they must accept the first offer that they get. And that's down from 3 offers, which was just in 2021. A survivor told us that she was offered a dilapidated unit. The story was horrendous. And she was pressured by her regional manager to take that unit or she would be removed from the waitlist altogether. This was so traumatizing for her that she moved to a different region and just gave up. Our research also shows that social housing providers are unlikely to permit crisis transfers to survivors who are already living in social housing. And so what happens is they must leave housing, apply for SPP just to get back into social housing. So there goes our loop again. Oh, yeah, I'm one step ahead. So affordable housing is rent that is 30% of a person's income and may be subsidized by a government program. But due to the financialization of housing, compounded by the fact that Ontario has no rent or vacancy controls, the province is, of course, facing a major affordability crisis. When I first started working in housing about 7 or 8 years ago in Toronto, we used to have an affordable housing list that we thought was really bad. It was 15 pages long. But now we maybe will have 8 units for all of Toronto and Scarborough, which maybe makes up half a page. Although the Canada-Ontario Housing Benefit, which is COB, was introduced to subsidize market rent, only 1.2% of selected eligible households were granted it. COB is set to expire in 2029, and we heard from our survivors that they don't know what they're going to do in 2030. So survivors' only remaining option is to go onto the unregulated private market, where survivors told us of facing discrimination and exploitation. Our research showed that the stigma of GBV itself resulted in landlords refusing to rent to survivors. And we also heard of survivors providing sex for rent, free labor, or for landlords asking a year's rent up front. And we heard that newcomers, migrant workers, and undocumented survivors face these forms of discrimination and exploitation the most severely. We also heard of landlords offering unlivable units to survivors, like the units without kitchens. Research completed again by our friends at WomanACT actually showed that 91% of survivors live in core housing need. And from ACTO's research, overall in this landlord's market, at least 40% of tenants are paying unaffordable rent. So up on the slide is our map again, and you can see the average and medium asking prices of 1 and 2 bedrooms in Ottawa, Kingston, Toronto, Windsor, and Thunder Bay. As you can see, low-income survivors, especially those with children who are probably going to need more than 1 bedroom, are going to be priced right out of this rental market, with the average market rent being $3,400 plus. So they really don't have a choice. They either remain homeless and cycling through this this map that I've showed you, or they will return back to the perpetrator. And this is a quote from a survivor who did get into private market rent after she left the perpetrator. Every day for her is a struggle. She said, "Now in my retirement, I'm really, really tired. I'm really tired. I'm drowning now. And each month, it's like a struggle to just come up with that, other $1,000 for the rent and to live. Meagerly, too. This isn't living. It's certainly not thriving. It's hardly even living."
And then survivors' housing stability is further threatened when they run into legal issues in rental units that they rent either by themselves or with the perpetrator. And this is due to the current state of housing legal services, as well as the lack of legal protections that exist for survivors. And so the type of rental issues they might face, which often lead to eviction, with the most common being, first, arrears. This is often due to financial abuse or a relationship breakdown. Then comes damages, where it's often caused by perpetrators and the survivor doesn't have the funds to pay for the necessary repair costs to stay in the unit. They also are living in very dilapidated units that are often in disrepair. Survivors reported having to deal with mold, pests, and exposed wiring. Often, too, survivors were unable to access any tenant protections when only the perpetrator was a person named on the lease, or in situations where they shared a kitchen and a bathroom with a landlord. Landlords also will threaten eviction to tenants, or specifically survivors, due to ongoing GBV. This is due to noise complaints and also interfering with others' reasonable enjoyment of their units. An emerging trend that has also come out of our research is that there has been a prevalence of landlord abuse, where landlords have begun entering into sexual relationships and intimate partner relationships with survivors in the return for housing. Also, roommate abuse has also been raised, and this is due to the rise of illegal boarding houses. And then lastly, survivors, even when they are evicted and try to get into new units, they're often discriminated against from prospective landlords due to GBV, race, family status, income, and sexuality. And when the survivors face these carousel of legal issues, they often choose to leave rather than risk cycling through the housing continuum again. And we heard from various survivors that they were unaware that tenant rights even existed or that there were housing legal services that they could access. And even though they might have had some knowledge of some housing services, they chose not to pursue it in fear of retaliation from their landlord, the perpetrator, or because there was too much on their plate. So this is a statement from one of our participants. A survivor stated, "I should have sought some sort of legal help there, but I also didn't want to stay there. Yeah, I wanted to get out of there and get away from them as soon as I could, but I knew I was being illegally evicted, but it wasn't a safe place for me to be." This brings us to the current state of our housing legal services. And survivors, if they do want to get legal help, this is what they can choose from in Ontario. First is community legal clinics. These are services for low-income tenants that provide legal advice and representation free of charge. But one of the challenges that has been raised is that often survivors are turned away because their income is considered too high to be eligible, or because clinics right now are being overburdened by housing cases due to what's going on in the affordability crisis, and they're unable to take them on. And due to the demand, clinics have had to prioritize eviction prevention over tenant applications. And with 46% of survivors dealing with maintenance and repair issues, it's a big gap. Next is pro bono legal services. These are when private bar lawyers will offer services paid for by Legal Aid Ontario for low-income residents. But legal aid will only cover 30 minutes of free advice, which is not enough time for anyone, let alone somebody who is experiencing GBV, and it can often be re-traumatizing. Although there are certificates provided for family, criminal, and immigration, there are no certificates provided by legal aid for housing. And if a survivor has too high of an income to qualify for either of these, they can try and seek affordable legal services. And this is when legal professionals may offer sliding scale rates, but these are far and few between. And in a study conducted by ACTO, only 8% of tenants received any legal representation for their landlord and tenant board hearing. This leads many survivors then to turn to non-legal housing help. In our service provider survey, 36% of housing workers spent their time supporting survivors with their tenancy issues, but survivors reported that oftentimes they were unintentionally being given incorrect legal information or quasi-legal advice. And the experience of having to navigate this plethora of housing legal services leaves many survivors having to fight on their own or abandoning their legal issues completely. And when survivors were able to access legal services, they reported the process as intimidating and re-traumatizing. In our survey of housing legal professionals, 27% had no training on the unique rental issues of survivors. And one survivor stated, "I was scared to talk to lawyers because the lawyers I have talked to, even the ones in my community that I should have been able to trust, I had a kind of weird experience with. They weren't kind or understanding or as trauma-informed as I needed them to be for how sensitive my situation was." And our research has shown that even when lawyers are informed and raise GBV arguments at the LTB, it often goes unacknowledged in the final decision. The lack of decisions that fail to raise GBV means that there are no precedents that either legal professionals or survivors can rely on at their hearings. This is a huge gap because, as we know, law is built and based on precedents. As well, the existing laws can be hard to navigate, especially because there are few legal protections for survivors who rent. In Ontario, most residential tenancies are covered by the RTA. But survivors who wish to stay and remain in the unit and remove the perpetrator from the lease have little option to do so because it requires consent from everybody. Even if the perpetrator has left and no longer lives there, or the survivor has a protection order, the perpetrator is still considered a tenant in that unit and can regain access to it. The RTA also allows survivors to terminate their tenancy early through the N15 form, but our research has shown that this has limited usefulness in light of the affordability context, and the reason being is because landlords often profit from tenants leaving. And for low-income survivors who live in social housing, they do have to follow the Housing Services Act, also known as the HSA. A major challenge is the eligibility rules, especially for the Special Priority Program, or SPP, that Care mentioned. It does not reflect the realities of GBV. Survivors must apply within 3 months of leaving the perpetrator and have to provide proof of cohabitation. This is not enough time for most people to deal with these issues and submit an application, and also they often don't have access to documents that support this. SPP only covers certain types of relationships as well, where one survivor stated that she was denied because the perpetrator was her landlord. And to mitigate the risk of harm, the HSA does allow service managers to use discretion, but our research has shown that oftentimes service managers use this type of discretion indiscriminately. For example, some service managers will make an exception to the 3-month eligibility rule if stalking has occurred, but others will make 0 exemptions at all. And also, no one is eligible for social housing in Ontario if they have an outstanding balance with a former social housing provider without a registered repayment plan. And we've heard social housing managers explicitly state that they would never enter into a repayment plan with a former tenant. This is a huge bar and blocks survivors from accessing SPP, which is often the only type of affordable housing they can go to. And these cases often are complicated, and some legal professionals will decide not to take them on. But although these gaps exist, we've had some success in the soft launch of our services. So we're pleased to introduce Canada's first specialized housing legal service for tenants experiencing gender-based violence. And the way that the service is designed, it's comprised of 8 parts. The first being legal representation to keep people housed and prevent them from being evicted into an unaffordable housing market. This includes tenant applications, advocacy work on expanding eligibility rules, and taking on precedent-setting cases. We'll also provide wraparound support in a legal and social work team. This allows us to provide support for non-legal needs because, as we know, oftentimes the legal issues are not the end of it, and often there's not enough legal solutions as well. All team members have also taken trauma and violence-informed training and integrated into our practice, and that is by extending appointments, meeting clients where they are at in their housing journey, and ensuring that choice to pursue legal action is what they want. We're also low barrier in that we've taken away all income eligibility rules, and we do not have time limits to our service, so anybody who's a tenant experiencing gender-based violence in Ontario would be able to access our services free of charge. We're collaborative in that we've taken time to get to know the actors in the GBV and legal sector, and we're also part of a multidisciplinary team encompassing family and criminal law with the Your Way Forward project. We're informed and evaluated by key informants and survivors, and we're also recruiting for a lived experience advisory panel as well. And as most territories and clinics have legal clinics of some sort, our goal is for this to be easily replicated beyond and as well as within community legal clinics in Ontario, since housing legal workers already exist. And because the law is so limited, law reform is really needed to improve survivors' chances at achieving long-term housing stability. So as service providers working in a specialized legal clinic, we have a unique position to contribute to ongoing efforts with our community partners, such as WomanACT Safe at Home project. I'll now pass it on to Deechley.
Thanks, Michelle. So I'll be talking about Safe at Home as a housing solution for women at risk of homelessness. So Safe at Home programs enable women fleeing violence to remain safely in their existing homes or move directly to independent housing with little disruption. Using a combination of legal tools, safety measures, and wraparound support services, Safe at Home programs work to remove the perpetrator from home and reduce the risk of harm to women and their children. So the most common housing trajectory that we heard about was survivors were living with their partner in the private rental market, and they were often listed on the lease for that unit. But then, at point of separation, survivors were typically the one to leave the shared home while the perpetrators remained there. And then, when leaving, they access temporary housing options, most commonly, as mentioned by Michelle, staying with family, friends, or going to an emergency shelter. So Safe at Home programs involve working together with several core partners, such as community agencies, the criminal justice system, housing providers, and child protection services. They have effectively prevented women's homelessness, reduced the disruption to children's education, eliminated the detrimental economic impacts of moving, and reduce the incidence of intimate partner violence. Despite being successfully implemented in many jurisdictions in Australia and United Kingdom, Ontario has yet to offer Safe at Home as a housing option for survivors. And I have to note that Canadians spend $7.4 billion per year with the aftermath of spousal abuse. So Safe at Home programs also proved to result in cost savings for service agencies, housing providers, and criminal justice system. So we asked the survivors which of the following options did they experience in the first housing option they accessed after separating from their partner. And as you can all imagine, this created a number of life disruptions for survivors, where in the first housing option they accessed after separation, at least half of the survivors or more had disruption to social relationships and service access, felt a loss of control over their housing options, and still felt at risk of harm from their partner. And then we asked if their desired supports were in place, which of the following options would they most prefer? And 76% answered safe-at-home housing options, which are moving to a new home in the private rental housing market, moving to a new home through a housing program, or staying in their shared home without their partner. So we asked their desired supports and what they thought about the safe-at-home housing model as an alternative. And as with any program, there were perceived benefits and there were concerns. I'll just highlight here the key concern that really came forward, and that was the affordability. When we shared with survivors what the program model could look like, the main issue we heard back was, well, I can just afford housing costs on my own. So that really stood out as something that would need to be addressed in order for safe-at-home programs to be feasible for survivors. We also asked their other program preferences, and they mentioned legal order to prevent partner, ex-partner from coming home or prevent abuse, changing locks on home, a case manager to help with issues and services, and wraparound support services, which are counseling, legal advocacy, peer support. And then we conducted a policy analysis for provincial and municipal housing programs and policies in Ontario and Toronto. And we found out that there are some strategies and opportunities we can use. For instance, municipal strategies on gender-based violence and housing, like Housing TO for Toronto and gender equity strategy. Existing networks and service system planning tables and multi-agency risk tables and situation tables that could work with anti-VAW agencies. There are some municipal programs regarding eviction prevention, rent subsidies, and housing allowances that can be leveraged. There's a federal interest in addressing women's hidden homelessness, and we found out that there are some municipal partnerships with private landlords. But we not only need the shifts in policies and housing programs, but also in the gender norms and attitudes, because we must confront the systemic inequalities that trap the survivors through that. Some of them are suggesting that shelters are the only option for survivors, the expectation that people experiencing violence should have to leave or move. There's a separation between the anti-VAW and the housing and homelessness sectors, and I know that some of our colleagues who are presenting in another room right now are trying to merge the two sectors in their projects currently. That violence has to be physical to necessitate this kind of intervention, but what we found out through our research, that coercive control is a very prevailing violence that's seen in intimate partner violence. And the money for women's housing. So there are some common challenges across the policies and programs, and some of them are unsupportive application processes. Access to some services and supports are exclusively through justice system. Program offerings and eligibility have gendered definition of homelessness, which creates hidden homelessness mentioned by my colleague. Assumptions about leaving home and accessing only shelters and housing. Limited recognition of right to housing or trauma-informed approach. And limited recognition of root causes of gender inequities and norms. So I will not mention the challenges further in different housing policies and programs, but talk about their strengths and opportunities that we found in some of the existing policies. For municipal housing allowances, there are a bunch of them, and proportion of housing allowances are earmarked for people experiencing domestic violence. In Housing Services Act, the legislation notes the provincial interest in providing a broad spectrum of housing options that offer positive incomes for individuals and families, meet housing needs in ways to address other social challenges, treat people with dignity, integrate with community services, and support economic prosperity. The Special Priority Program could also be positioned as a pathway into safe-at-home programs. When women experiencing violence apply for social housing, they could be referred to participate in safe-at-home programs, whether in the rent-geared income unit or other housing options secured sooner. There are also justice policies and programs that we explored, and For instance, in Policing Standards Manual on Domestic Violence Occurrences, it provides guidance on protocols when attending domestic violence incidents and requires police forces to develop policies and procedures. And Integrated Domestic Violence Court, it combines criminal and family court proceedings for domestic violence cases for better coordination. And finally, we also explored income security policies and programs because it's necessary to answer to the question of affordability that was proposed by the survivors. So there are 2 social assistance programs in Ontario. One of them is called Ontario Works, and the other one is Ontario Disability Support Program. Their strengths are survivors maintain benefit amounts when relocating to interval and transition houses in order to preserve their right to return to previous home, and social assistance recipients can access emergency housing funds with housing impacts of domestic violence acknowledged as a reason. So I would like to conclude with a quote from one of the research participants. The last thing you want is there to be additional hoops you have to jump through. It's like, it's silly. Can you just try to set it up in a way where we have as much agency and choice as possible, and then we can decide what we want to do. We would like to thank you for listening to us. You can find our information. I would also like to invite people who are interested in talking more about the policy analysis, the opportunities, levers, and the strategies that we can use in advocacy with the provincial, federal governments. So if you can send me an email saying that you're interested in, we can just continue this session further with more details. Thank you.
Hi, I'm Ann Decter. I'm with the Canadian Women's Foundation. I work there as a Senior Director of Policy and some small granting. And I'm here with my colleague, Karen, who will now introduce herself.
Hi, everyone. I'm Karen Campbell, also a Senior Director of Community Initiatives and Policy at the Foundation. And we are pleased to be here today. Thank you for welcoming us. The work of the Canadian Women's Foundation and the organizations that we support takes place on traditional First Nations, Métis, and Inuit territories. We are grateful for the opportunity to gather with you all today in Mi'kma'ki, the traditional territory of the Mi'kmaq people. At the Foundation, we're committed to pursuing truth, reconciliation, decolonization, and allyship with First Nations, Métis, and Inuit people.
So a little bit about the Foundation. To start out, we are Canada's public foundation for gender equality. That means we're not a private foundation funded by a family or anything. We raise and spend the money that we raise. So we're always constantly fundraising. We don't have a huge endowment. We've been around for more than 30 years. We were founded in response to feminists realizing that there was a very, very small percentage of philanthropic funds given out by foundations that were dedicated to, that were going to women's and gender equality organizations. It was about 2%. So granting is at the core of our work. We fund organizations across Canada through funding streams such as Rebuilding Lives, which is after violence work, economic development, teen healthy relationships, Girls Fund, and lately also we've been doing work through the Investment Readiness Program with social enterprise organizations. We also work to achieve systemic change because we know that grants to organizations and helping people one by one is extremely important, but systemic change can change many lives at once. And we do that work through research, knowledge sharing, policy work, and advocacy. Now let's see what it takes. So we want to give you a little background before Karen launches into talking about a specific tool that we've created recently. As many of you are aware, gender-based violence, intimate partner violence, family violence, and homelessness are intimately connected. Not only does violence drive women, children, youth, and gender-diverse people from their homes, but being unhoused places everyone at higher risk of violence. The COVID pandemic and lockdown confirmed what many of us already understood. Gender-based violence increases when crises put communities under stress. At the Foundation, we are aware of this from the Fort McMurray wildfire in 2016, and also of research released on this related to Hurricane Katrina impacts. As March of 2020 rolled into April and May, we are hearing about it as the pandemic lockdown lengthened with no sign of let-up. What that looked like was shelters experiencing an eerie silence, followed by surging demand for services. This was because there was an understanding that shelters were closed, which was not true, and Karen will say more about that, but so there was a surge once people realized they were open. Increase in domestic violence calls to police, increases in workplace sexual harassment and violence, increases in youth contacting sexual assault centers and in particular wanting to text about their situations, increased severity and complexity of violence reported, and an increased femicide rate in Canada 2019 to 2022 that also continues to this day. This increase was a global phenomenon, sparking UN Women to declare a shadow pandemic while lockdown restrictions were still underway. We also saw economic impacts with economic security and rising poverty. We know that's a driver of increases in homelessness and more people becoming unhoused. The impacts of the COVID pandemic and lockdown on women's employment were immediate, massive, and most felt by those with lowest incomes. Women accounted for 63% of the 1 million jobs lost in the first month of the pandemic. Employment losses were largest amongst those in precarious jobs, where it's mostly women working. Almost 60% of the lowest income women, those earning $14 an hour or less, were laid off or lost the majority of their work hours in February to April 2020. And this lowest earning group is overwhelmingly women and highly racialized, with Black women, Indigenous women, and women of color. I will say that there have been improvements since then. We actually had record employment for women in December of 2022. The increases have leveled off, but again, the issues are really, there's a disparity across income groups, what's going on. So the crisis impacts of gender-based violence, loss of income, led to a lot of loss of housing. It's a formula for loss of housing, and add in post-emergency inflation, and these crisis impacts drive the kind of increases in unhoused women and gender-diverse people that we are experiencing today. And just a note on experiences of gender-based violence in Canada, as noted on the slide, the pandemic compounded existing crisis conditions for First Nations, Métis, and Inuit women. Women with disabilities were already 3 times more likely to experience violence before the pandemic lockdown. Trans people are always at higher risk of all forms of gendered violence, and we see that increasing daily with the campaigns that are going on. And Black and racialized women are both less likely to report and less likely to be believed. The point made by a service provider that needs didn't change the pandemic rings true. What happened was they were amplified, and that drove home to us the importance of having a service response and a policy response. And I'm going to hand over to Karen.
So in the summer of 2021, the Canadian Women's Foundation convened something that we called the Gender Justice Labs. And it was a series of online meetings of about 50 service providers in the gender-based violence sector nationally. And we asked the question, what do you think would have made the difference for you, for your organization, for your service users in the context of the pandemic? And what we heard was that service providers really see the need for a thriving women's and gender justice sector, not just getting by on shoestring budgets, but a sector that really thrives. They said that they needed to see emergency responses in their communities take into account the lived realities of the people that they serve, and that got articulated as having a gender-based plus analysis in risk and vulnerability assessments that happen at the local level and in emergency plans that flow from those risk assessments. They talked about violence prevention through culture shifts, so not Band-Aid solutions or project-based funding, but getting to the real root causes of the violence, and a call to not accept that spikes in gender-based violence in times of crisis are inevitable, and access to safe and affordable homes for women and gender-diverse people. What the pandemic lockdown and COVID really revealed is that we have a chronically underfunded sector with no surge capacity. At the same time as these increases in violence are happening in our communities, the community resources to support the targets of that violence are experiencing unprecedented challenges. So not only were gender-based violence services, including women's shelters and sexual assault centers, already overstretched due to decades of chronic underfunding and undervaluing, leaving them with no surge capacity to respond to this emerging and evolving crisis, but they needed to move quickly to sort out how to offer services in a radically altered context, online, by phone, by text, or where possible, how to do that safely in person. And remember as well that gender-based violence services are overwhelmingly provided by women whose home lives and caregiving responsibilities were also turned on their heads at the beginning of the pandemic. And that as important as gender-based violence services are in our communities, these workers are among the lowest paid in the nonprofit sector. So this meant that violence rates were increasing quickly and services were just not equipped to provide the supports that were needed. And what we see now is mass burnout, an exodus of employees from the gender-based violence sector. Women's Shelters Canada is documenting this, and they've called it a feminist brain drain. Recruiting and retaining shelter workers is becoming increasingly difficult at all levels, from direct service all the way up to executive directors. It's a real crisis in the sector. So zooming out a little bit to the broader context, in attention to the predictable increase of gender-based violence in emergency planning at all levels has had disastrous consequences for women and gender-diverse people, particularly those who are further marginalized by race, sexuality, gender expression, disability, immigration status, and or location in rural, remote and northern communities. So for example, as Anne alluded to at the top, public health messages urged people to avoid COVID-19 by staying home, but they didn't include messaging to indicate that women's shelters and sexual assault centers remained open, leading many victims to believe that there was nowhere to go and compounding the violence that they were experiencing at home. Few jurisdictions were collecting disaggregated data on the impact of COVID-19 on different groups, so it took months for public health officials to recognize the extent of the disproportionate impacts on women, girls, and gender-diverse people, especially for BIPOC and disabled people. Social service providers in the women's and gender justice sector complained that months into the pandemic, when it became increasingly clear that the impacts were not being felt equally and that gender-based violence was on the rise, those responsible for emergency responses in their communities, be it emergency managers at the municipal level, public health officials, they began to reach out to them then for advice at the moment when they were most stretched and had the least capacity to engage. So we followed up on these reports that we were hearing from folks in the sector with some academic research about emergency plans at the provincial and territorial levels. And it really confirmed what these service providers were reporting to us. In an extensive review of emergency planning documents, we found that most federal, provincial, and territorial emergency management and pandemic planning guidance that was developed prior to the COVID-19 pandemic was gender neutral. Our research shows that risk assessments, disaster and emergency plans didn't take the gendered realities of the immediate crisis impacts and their aftermath into account. Despite official commitments to apply GBA Plus to all policies and programs, the federal government has yet to provide provincial, territorial, and municipal emergency planners with sufficient or specific guidance on how to use GBA Plus. And most emergency plans fail to even mention women. So as you can see on the slide, in 6 of the federal level plans that we reviewed, 2 mention women, 3 mentioned gender, and 1 mentioned violence. In a review of 28 regional plans, we found that 5 mentioned women, 2 referred to gender, and 2 mentioned domestic violence. And at the municipal level, where a lot of the actual hands-on response to a disaster occurs, that's where the rubber hits the road, none of them had any reference to women or gender at all. So we've identified that building the capacity of professionals in the emergency management field and raising the standards really for disaster and emergency management in Canada is necessary if plans are going to respond to the lived realities of those who stand to be most impacted. So coming back now to the service provider level, we also heard from service providers that they had emergency plans for their organizations. Some of them had them. Some of them were like dusty binders on the shelf. They didn't necessarily provide guidance for the scale of the emergency that COVID was bringing to their doors. So maybe they would have a plan for what happens if our facility floods or there's a fire, or what happens if a dangerous perpetrator comes to our door, how are we going to respond, but not what happens if our entire service model is impacted, and so are the service models of all of our friends in the sector, and like how are we going to actually deal with this? And so we started to work with some emergency management professionals who have been attempting to put a gender-based analysis on the work that they do in their field, and we asked them to adapt something that they call in their sector business continuity management to social services, and to put a gender-based analysis on it. So if you work for a government agency or for a large corporation, they probably have a business continuity plan that they can enact in the case of an emergency. We don't really have anything like that in our sector. So we worked with this team of consultants, and we surveyed 215 organizations across Canada and assembled a 15-member sector advisory committee to inform the process. And what we ended up creating was what we call service continuity guidelines for the gender-based violence sector. And it was really important to us that this document was sort of agnostic to the type of emergency or disaster. So it's not a pandemic response toolkit, but something that would support an organization to create an emergency plan for any kind of emergency or disaster. And in doing so, we realized at the end of the process that this is great for gender-based violence services, but it's also widely applicable to other social service agencies that want to undertake a planning process without hiring very expensive consultants to come in and do this with your team, and in a way that's accessible and as simple as we could make a complicated process. So the toolkit that we created walks you through the basics of service continuity planning. It helps you to identify your critical functions as an organization and develop strategies to fortify those functions in the case of an emergency. And throughout, it helps you to think about the ways that the emergency or disaster will affect populations that you serve differently, and the strategies that you develop to fortify your critical functions to make sure that they are taking the needs into account of those who are experiencing multiple and intersecting forms of discrimination and oppression. And I think that that's really an interesting way of going about service continuity planning that really, I think, keeps our intersectional feminist values at the core, in a way that business continuity management in the emergency management field doesn't do, actually. So it was an interesting project of integrating both our worlds and the emergency management field, and sensitizing them as well to the lived realities of the folks that we're all working with. So the tool is divided into 5 sections that will help you, as I said, identify your critical functions and your fortification strategies. And it starts out with some basic stuff, naming your mission, values, goals, and objectives. Most organizations have this already in existing documents and strategic plans that you've probably created. And then from there, you move to sorting out what your critical functions are and what resources you need to realize your mission. And then next, you consider what could interrupt your critical functions or impede access to the resources that you need to fulfill your mission. And then you move into a reflection on how you will continue to deliver your critical functions in the event of an emergency. And finally, your strategic thinking about who will do what, when, and how during or following an emergency or a disruption. And throughout the toolkit, there are activities and worksheets to guide you through the process. And I want to note as well that this isn't actually designed to solve the underlying conditions of an underfunded sector that's already dealing with unmet needs. We know that a lot of organizations are in crisis mode more or less all the time, but what this does is it gives you a framework to help you think about emergency management and planning in a way that's accessible and that you can do internally at your organization, as I said, without hiring teams to work with you to do it. And we will have an online course version of this coming soon, which we hope will make it even easier to follow rather than looking at our bulky PDF. Even though it is beautifully designed, it's not something that a lot of people are going to take the time to do. So we hope that the course version will help with uptake on it. And for us, it's critically important that the guidance provided includes prompts to think about your planning through an intersectional gender lens. And that means thinking about what is a critical function? Critical for whom? For why? Under what conditions? How will the strategies that you develop work for different populations of service users with unique and diverse needs? If you decide that one of your strategies, for example, is that in the event of an emergency, you're going to pause non-urgent work, who's going to decide what's urgent? What will you cut? Who will that leave behind? So these are the kinds of prompts that are going to be, asked of you as you're going through the process. Because we really need that to be integrated from the start and not applied afterwards. So the slide is just an example of, one of the pages in the toolkit and how that will guide you through. And the last part of our presentation is about some continuing directions for our work that I'd like to share, that we'd like to share with you. The guidelines will support service providers, but we're also looking at these other more structural and systemic change initiatives as well. So we are building out our research on the gender gap in emergency management. In a weird way, we're becoming really well-versed in emergency management jargon and lingo, which is not something we ever anticipated really in our day-to-day work. But right now what we're doing is working with a team of researchers to review the guidance or the instructions that provinces and territories hand to municipalities. So we've come to learn that the provinces and the territories have emergency management legislation, and they're responsible for providing guidance to municipalities about how they conduct their risk assessments in community. And we're going to do a review and find out if any of them are asking about gendered impacts, intersectional impacts, and asking the municipalities to actively do that. Our instinct is no, they're not, but we want to be able to put that on paper and demonstrate that that's the case. We've also learned that emergency managers are certainly not gender-based analysis experts, and we've learned that the level of training actually for emergency managers at the municipal levels, especially in small communities, is not that robust actually. And so there's really a capacity building piece that needs to happen within that field. So we're working on that. And in the absence of GBA plus guidance for municipal emergency managers, we're going to make it. We're going to make a toolkit that is for the municipal level. So that's what's happening for us now in the next year or so to sort of try to build out the capacity there.
Yeah, and I also want to let you know that Public Safety Canada is actually currently conducting a national risk assessment process. You may or may not be aware of this, but they are doing this now, and they've requested community impact. So embedded in our slides is a link to their survey, and if you want to provide inputs about how emergencies, disasters, crises are affecting your service users, the people in your community, please fill out the survey. The more data that they can get from social service providers, I think the better. And I'll turn it back to Anne.
So one other place that this work has led us is to climate crisis events, which we all know, the summer that we just had, they are continuing, they are mounting. And so we are really taking a look at where there has been attention to really gender justice in the climate crisis. We're looking at a scan of federal climate policies and initiatives to see whether a gender lens, an intersectional gender lens, has been incorporated. We're looking at how to center the leadership of First Nations, Métis, and Inuit women in our climate work and in climate work generally, and both gender-based violence and the impact on unhoused people and on increases in homelessness will be part of that work. So, the learning that when communities are under stress, whether from climate-induced disasters like floods, fires, economic downturns, or public health rates of gender-based violence increase. It drives the work that we've been talking about today, and also work that we have underway on climate crisis impacts. And we're looking forward to continuing this work in the future as crises continue to occur. Thank you. We'll go. There, and that's where you can find us if you're looking for us.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much to everyone. A question, do we have a mic that can, okay. Thank you so much. I have so many questions, but I won't take up all the space. But I just wanted to say, as someone who works in this field, but also someone who has lived experience of homelessness and gender-based violence myself, I think it's really important to be talking about this, and I am glad to have such an amazing panel to be opening up this discussion to. And I also know that sometimes it can be really difficult to see these things represented through research projects like this, so I wanted to say after the panel, if anyone wants to chat, I will be around, and I'm happy to talk through anything if people need. But we do have about half an hour, 25 minutes, and so I will open it up to questions. If you want to ask a question, I can, someone else can bring the mic around. That's lovely.
Thank you. This is amazing work. I'm just wondering what is, and I guess maybe for everyone, but maybe the first presenters a bit more, what is that collaboration or that work with, in BC it would be Ministry of Children and Family Development. I think in Ontario it's CAS, because kind of what we see is someone will experience gender-based violence. If it's perpetrated in front of a child, that's child abuse, and so the child might be apprehended. And then if housing is lost, then someone will try and seek housing, but if it's socialized housing, they won't be offered a 2-bedroom if they don't have guardianship of the child. And then MCFD or Child Protective Services will then say, oh, but you don't meet the kind of guidelines of housing to get your child back. And it's quite a vicious cycle. And so I wonder, especially I think from a legal perspective, what are alternatives that you found?
So that's a really good question. I don't know. Hello? Okay. Okay, sorry. So that's a really good question. So because our work is mostly, it's all like landlord and tenant board based law for residential tenancies, we don't do child protection cases.
It's not working?
Have to get closer. Yeah.
Hello. Gosh, okay. This is really intimate with the mic. Okay. So because we cover more residential tenancy-based things, we don't cover child protection cases. And I know that's the issue when it comes to even like the Housing Services Act, right? Because that would involve more of like a family lawyer having to intervene or a lawyer for children, for the youth, to kind of intervene in those cases. That's why we're trying to make sure that in our collaboration with the Your Way Forward project, that there are links, because some of the other clinics that involved do those type of work already. Example of that, which there's actually a colleague in the crowd, is from Justice for Children and Youth, which is also a specialty legal clinic in Ontario that focuses on more kind of those type of areas. So that's how we're doing the collaborative part, because we know we can't cover every area of law, especially when it comes to GBV. It touches on so many things. They're dealing with family issues, family law issues, criminal law proceedings at the same time, on top of them possibly losing their tenancy or trying to get back into housing. So ours is to cover the housing component while also working with other organizations that cover the legal components that might be family, criminal-based. We have some connections as well with Barbara Schleifer and Luke's Place, which are also two big kind of specialty hubs that have lawyers for family and criminal law as well in Ontario that specialize for gender-based violence. So working kind of all together where they can also send their housing cases to us. That's how we're trying to work with the sector, since everyone is very tight already. That's the kind of the gap that we're filling. Yeah.
Hi, this question's maybe for the folks from Canadian Women's Foundation. Love what you're bringing and love the work that you're doing. I think part of the frustration as someone who's been doing work in women serving agencies for a long time is that we know this stuff. So how do we work together to motivate political change and systemic change? Because the news isn't different, right? It's the same every time we talk about it, but we just don't seem to get any uptake. And even when they say they're gonna do a GBA plus at the federal level, we know they don't do it. Our province isn't talking about it really at all. So how do we collectively use our resources, knowledge, skills, whatever, to get to a point where we can make this message clear to decision makers that the sector is underfunded, the sector is dying, almost literally, and if we don't do something quickly, we're going to be in a much worse situation than we're in right now.
Take it away. Thank you, Karen. So I think you have some instructive things to say about the level of gap in emergency planning, and really that's a chipping away at the block of ice. That's a huge question, and it's the key question. Thank you, Lori, for raising it. We've done a lot of stuff recently. We were fairly effective during the pandemic at getting to women and gender equality in particular, and getting money from the federal government. They gave a lot of money through us and through Women's Shelters Canada. They were small grants, emergency grants, but they were over $100 million between the two organizations. Problem we're seeing now is a lot of those are stopping, and really valuable programs that got started won't be continuing. And right now the federal government they want to bring in a budget that's lower. So the doors are really not open the way they were for a long time. But we just have to keep at it. There's no standing down. So like we had a little bit of money, we hired someone to scan all those climate policies and see what's going on with them, because you hear from Women and Gender Equality, or WAGE as we call it at the time, that they are responsible for GBA plus across the whole of government federally. But we don't get an update on where it is. And we also see when the budgets come out, it's an after the policy analysis. Well, this is how it affects, on the basis of gender, and that's not good enough. It needs to be in it as the policy is built. So I think it's just, continuing the pressure and hoping we're not headed for a government who couldn't care less about any of this, because we've all seen that before. There are conversations about maybe we could get a huge amount of money out of the government to have a separate fund to sustain women's and gender equality organizations. We saw it with the Foundation for Black Communities. We saw it with the Equality Fund. Again, the timing on that's a little hard, but there are a number of us who've been talking about it and kind of waiting out this budget and trying to go for it in the next budget, and so that it would be positioned to give out core funding, as the government hates that word, but operational funding on an ongoing basis is what we're trying for. It's a huge ask, and it's even hard to get through the door with it, but that is something that a number of organizations who work at the national level have been trying to do.
I would say on the emergency management front, it's an opportunistic time in a way to move that demand forward, that government actually use a GBA plus lens, because I think that they've recognized that it's sorely lacking in emergency management and response. Maybe I can give a community-based example. We've been talking to an organization in Toronto that serves precarious status and undocumented migrant people. And in the pandemic, when public health tried to do their vaccine rollout, they clearly hadn't accounted for undocumented people or precarious status migrant people in their pandemic planning. And it became very, very clear that everybody needs to be vaccinated, not just citizens of this country, not just permanent residents of this country. And so they went to this, this community organization, grassroots, operating on small budgets, and said, please help us reach this population. I mean, the gall, really, to go to a community organization in that moment and ask for that support and help. And that community organization then had to not only help the vaccine rollout reach that population, but also convince people in that population that it was a safe intervention and that the state, was doing something that would be helpful to them in a way that that they did not trust. And so, like, those kinds of glaring gaps that really impact all of us, not just, one group or subgroup of the population. I think that those kinds of examples, lifting those up, helps to make it abundantly clear that that kind of work needs to be done. An intersectional approach to policy making and in practice is crucial.
Hi, thanks. Not a question, just a comment generally. So I came this morning. I wasn't really sure what the presentations are going to be about, but man, am I happy I came. So particularly Anne and Karen. So I'm a city councillor with the city of Yellowknife. As many of you know, we were evacuated this summer, as well as had several evacuations to our city before we had a mass evacuation. So more a comment just to say, keep up the work. As you were presenting 24 municipalities, well, you can count 25 because I'm sure we weren't part of your research. And we have nothing that relates to any of what you're talking about in our emergency management plan. And so we're going into a review of our emergency management plan now. So if you want to come talk to City Council, I'll be your advocate at City Council. And territorial government's doing a review as well. So get in that door. And I would just say, as you talk about advocacy, I mean, I used to do advocacy in another world and another time in my life, but try and hit up smaller municipalities like us, because if you get us on board, we start the ball rolling at the smaller, easier level where we have gone through this, we can make change faster than the feds. We can get that going. So just that's more a comment than a question, but thank you, and I will be getting in touch with both of you. Thanks.
I have no control up here. It's making me very uncomfortable.
Hi, I had a question for Michelle. Do people have to actually have a case in LTB to be able to access the services, or can it be prior?
No, so that's what we're trying to catch people at, is prior, but also because we run the Tenant Duty Council program, and that's served on the same day as somebody's LTB hearing. It's also to catch those as well. But that's why especially our legal director and our admin director applied for this funding, was because most of the time people, especially those experiencing GBV, were not getting legal help until the day of their hearing when they found out that Tenant Duty Council exists, right? And at that point, it's very difficult to intervene because there's no evidence that has been submitted. They have no representation. They're going in self-represented. So they're basically pleading to a board, to an adjudicator for them not to be evicted immediately and just to have some grace to stay. So that's why we're trying to catch people before, so that we can represent them, go to the hearing for them, file their materials, and try to fight for them either to stay and remain in the unit or so that they can be given some relief from eviction. Also because of the HSA work that we're doing on the Housing Services Act, we know a lot of people do end up losing the housing that they're in, especially those who are survivors. So working to also get them in to housing if eviction does happen, advocating for them on all levels of government so that they can be brought into SPP. If not, we've already dealt with a case where somebody was denied it for arrears. Every lawyer that we talked to in the clinic system told us that good luck, we're probably not going to get anywhere. But we kept pushing, right? And it's basically holding a mirror, especially to those accountable, that, hey, the legislation allows you to do this, so we're asking you to do it. Like, put your kind of money where your mouth is. So that's what we're hoping to do.
Yeah, if we were successful, that person's not housed.
Yeah.
So.
Just more of a comment for the Canadian Women's Foundation around the ties between public safety and domestic violence, and the Mass Casualty Commission report out of Nova Scotia. I think it draws a clear line for the public around public safety and domestic violence, that it's not a personal matter. Yeah. And so I think safety is priority. So it's nice to see, that tie as well to emergency planning as well. So looking forward to your workshop in the spring. Thank you.
I think there was a question back here.
Hi, I had to make some notes, so bear with me. I think I'd like to present a bit of a different perspective as a director of a shelter for abused women and children and people who are homeless. I think we have to be, and this is kind of to the Canadian Women's Federation, I'd like to just present a bit of a different perspective, that I think we need to be really careful that we don't present the intimate partner violence shelter sector as incapable of dealing with emergencies. So we all have business continuity plans. It's good business practice. It's required by our funders. And I just worry a little bit that absolutely COVID hit us really, really hard, as it hit the entire world really, really hard. And we had to adapt all of our services. We had to change all of our model of service delivery. But I just worry a little bit that we need to be careful that we don't make ourselves more vulnerable by saying that we don't have policies and things already in place. Happy to have any tool that can increase that, but we deal with emergencies every single day in the lives of the women and the families that we support. And I just want to make sure that we balance out the need for those tools and policies with an acknowledgement of the existing things that we already have and our ability to manage, to pivot, to pirouette, to do all of the things that we did during COVID.
Thanks very much for that comment. And in no way do we mean to diminish the crisis work that that folks in the sector are doing, and we hope that this tool will be supplementary and also support that intersectional gender analysis being placed on those kinds of plans. Certainly a lot of organizations do, you're right, have business continuity plans, especially in the shelter sector. Smaller grassroots organizations, not so much. Multi-service organizations doing different kinds of programming, to varying degrees is what we found. But we hope that this will be supplementary to things that are existing, building on good practice in the sector. Thanks.
Okay, I was like, I have questions.
Hello. I just have a question about the Safe at Home program, the one that talks about removing the perpetrator from the home. So I just wanted to ask if the victim, what happens if the victim is not on the lease or the mortgage? Because I have like a certain woman who's on my caseload that kind of comes to mind where she was displaced. she shared that home with the perpetrator and she was removed because she wasn't on the mortgage.
Maybe Michelle's okay.
So I can't speak to the mortgage necessarily because that's a little bit different than residential tenancies. But if the person's not, like the survivor's not on the lease, this is when it gets tricky and why you kind of need a lawyer to kind of intervene to help. You're making an argument at the board that there's an implied tenancy, basically, right? So depending on the facts and how it's been happening, you can try and argue that the person does actually fall under the definition of a tenant and they've established a tenancy, right? So because of that, they are covered by the RTA and the landlord cannot just evict, or not evict, but basically has to keep them there and the tenancy continues. There's also another option, something called an unauthorized occupant, where somebody would actually the landlord still has to go to the LTB to evict if the person stays past it. And then you're again going to the board to say, well, either if they didn't meet the timeline, then a tenancy has been established, or again, you're going to the board and arguing on the case of the survivor that they fall under the definition of a tenant. So that's kind of the gray area that we're trying to capture, hopefully, in some cases and putting it into not into legislation, putting some precedents so that people have some cases they can rely on at the hearing. Because right now, the board hasn't put any decisions out that explicitly state, right, in cases of GBV, things like that, somebody's been experiencing, they probably contributed financially a lot to that unit, that they should be considered a tenant still.
Thank you.
We actually had a case too where Michelle intervened at the landlord and tenant board and the adjudicator on their decision. Although Michelle had like a mic drop argument, they never talked about gender-based violence in the decision. They talked about a family situation. So we're trying to capture a lot of that as well so that there's, as Michelle said, precedents.
Awesome. My turn? Yeah. Thank you all for the amazing work you do and pushing the boundaries on some of that systemic change that we have to point out and say this isn't working and what can we do differently. I think everybody's doing great work within the sectors. I work at our local women's shelter for 15 years, casual relief, and my other job is Ontario Works caseworker, supervisor of the homelessness. So I get tired of social housing, special priority status, saying prove it. If you're in shelter, that's proof enough. So I think we have to look at the systems and we have to stop looking at the individual to do all the work needed in order to be eligible for housing and a safe and secure future story. I was worried I was going to get fired at my day job for calling them out on their eligibility for somebody in shelter. So I'm glad the light is shining on it. And we just have to change it now, we know that this is the issue and can we just stop? Somebody needs priority status for longer than 3 months, and they should not have to get a police record to say, yep, I get status now. It frustrates me that we would ask somebody to do that. So hats off to all of you for the great work that you're doing. Continue with it. That's all.
I think we have time for one more question. If you've got a burning question. I have a question. Thank you all, and thank you all for your questions. I think both of your presentations emphasize this kind of tension between addressing urgent crises in people's lives and care. Thank you for also speaking explicitly to the people that we work with and needing to ground. I know you talked about intersectional feminism as a grounding to your work too. The lives of people and the everyday experiences of women and other folks who we're serving. But you also pointed to these kind of systemic changes we need to be making. So I wonder if, to wrap up, each of you could speak to some of that work as you're trying to make these kinds of reforms or shifts to how services or legal frameworks are operating. What are the systemic or structural changes you're hoping to see in your work to contribute to this not having to be work you have to do anymore?
Thank you for the question. It has a very long answer, but I'll just summarize a couple of them. So we should first start with recognizing women's homelessness. That's number one, because currently most of the housing policies or programs that we analyzed, they don't really understand that how survivors are actually becoming homeless after an intimate partner violence incident. So that's number one. We have also been trying to get different housing solutions, such as Safe at Home, to the attention of the elected officials. That's why we've been meeting with federal or provincial elected officials since last year and trying to familiarize them with the idea that we can actually shift these gender norms and start to see that women have the right to housing, and we can cover this through either helping them remain safely in their homes or moving to independent housing in the private rental markets. We have identified that there are some struggles in the current policies and programs, but they are nothing that cannot be changed. And we find that the best way to show that Safe at Home works is to pilot it actually somewhere. And we have an idea, a proposal that's been pending currently funding to pilot the Safe at Home program in Ontario, where we have a high-risk agency table, which is called MARAC in Perth County. In this high-risk table, different agencies and governmental bodies, such as like from the health sector, justice sector, they come together and assess very high-risk gender-based violence cases. And it's a great tool to just assess the risk of a gender-based violence case and then propose Safe at Home as a program. So I have to say, like, we have been trying to do advocacy from different points, like working with the elected officials, municipality, and also trying to get this funding for a pilot program to show. I'd say thanks.
Anybody else? I can go next. I think Anne said it earlier, but for us, I think, or for me anyways, the big systemic change that I'd like to see is having a thriving women's and gender equality sector, where organizations are not just getting by on project-based funding, but can actually have the resources that they need to pay their staff well, so that their staff don't burn out or leave for more lucrative sectors, that the work can continue in a way that it's life-saving work, really, and it should be valued that way, not just in the budgets of the organizations, but in also how the sector is viewed socially in our society. It's not just a nice to have, it's really necessary, and that's the change I'd like to see.
Well, we have this overlarge policy framework, and we try to cover too many issues, and we're always getting instructed to narrow that down. But one of the things, we did have some of our senior staff on the Hill this week, talking to as many ministers who are willing to talk to us, and ministerial staff, so that one of the approaches we take is actually, like Karen and I would like to take this crisis work and emergency preparedness to talk to policy people in the minister's office and start to get them to see that this is something that needs to move through. And then if we can keep like a relationship like that ongoing, then they can start moving it up to the minister, and maybe at some point we can get a breakthrough, but some of them are very hard to get to. There was a 25% target for women's programs targeted to women in the National Housing Strategy when it was announced in 2017. And I had worked on that when I was at YWCA Canada. We had an effective day on the Hill and lobby around it. And it's a big organization. So I remember Mia Suokamotio from YWCA Halifax telling me that she had talked to Scott Bryson, who was at the time chair of the Treasury Board, and he liked the idea. So we had that kind of local going in. That's the advantage of national organizations that have local branches. You can have, national is talking to the government generally, or whatever's going on the Hill, and the local are talking to their MP, who might happen to be a key cabinet minister that you can get to. So one of the things that I put in the notes for the Hill this week was to make sure that that 25% target was continuing into the new initiatives that Minister Fraser was talking about yesterday, and moving through those so that we're still seeing that. The tracking on that has been hard to figure out, but there has been a lot of support from CMHC, who actually in their programs increased it to 33%, which I thought was great. Other things we're working on, we're supporting people who are moving the motions at local councils that have IPV declared a pandemic. Some of the work, the people who've been doing that work, and they worked on the Renfrew County coroner's inquiry, are trying to bring people together to see what they can do now that it's gone through so many communities, yet you have a provincial government that's resisting it. So trying to move like that. Yeah, I don't know. I can go on and on talking about organizing, obviously. And the other big thing is the National Action Plan on Gender-Based Violence, trying to make sure that as the agreements are signed at the provincial level, there is controls on what that money can be spent on, so it goes where the sector really thinks, the experts in the sector really think it needs to go. And Karen can talk to you more about that if anyone's interested. But that's just a few of the things that we'd love to see happen now, or yesterday.
I think, there goes my phone, so we'll get this later. I think coming from ACTO as well, we really want to speak to housing. People shouldn't have to suffer the indignity of not having a place to live, especially people who are going through violence. And I think ACTO does a lot of work on the commodification of housing and making housing a human right. So we work on things like bringing back rent control and vacancy decontrol. We want to see that kind of change as well. I don't think we can do one without the other. Also, it would be really nice if Ontario would implement a gender-based violence strategy. They took that away in 2019 with the change of government. So it would be great if our provincial government could recognize what's happening on the ground. And I think the way to do that is by talking to the people who have experienced it. I will say from our research and just from working with people, like you develop such great relationships. Those are the people with the knowledge. They know what it's like. I think that we need to listen to them. I think that I am very lucky that I have a nice degree and I can talk about this because I'm passionate about social justice, but I think that the people that really know the answers are the people who are on the ground and are living it. So.
I think Kara covered that really well. In addition to that, one of the systemic changes, especially on the law side, we're hoping to, we've reached out to the Law Society of Ontario as well to try and implement some better training around understanding gender-based violence in the legal context, especially because adjudicators and judges still, I think, have a lot of work to do on that, especially at the Landlord and Tenant Board. Don't know how familiar you guys are with the tribunal system, but they don't have to have any legal background, right? So these are former real estate agents, Olympic. There's an Olympian
hurdler is
right, and they're yes, and they're the ones deciding people's fate to basically keep the only housing they have or go into homelessness. And especially for people experiencing gender-based violence, you're sending somebody with higher risk of femicide, and also resulting in some severe consequences where they might not make it until they get even into a shelter. So I think making it more prevalent so that they understand the impact. Housing is a human right. It's not this thing of oh, well, the landlord is,
protecting our investment.
Yeah, protecting investments is trying to make those changes where they're starting to see that the fact that housing is a basic core need, right? If you don't have that, you have nothing. It's very difficult to pursue anything, especially for survivors. So we're really hoping to kind of implement some of that.
I'll add one more thing to that. As a social worker, I'm highly regulated, as well as Michelle, but landlords aren't. So again, anybody can be a landlord and you can house people. It is the hardest job to house people and to have people in your space and to go through these kind of complex issues. It's the hardest HR job ever. And yet you have people who don't have any understanding of these complex needs. And the easiest solution is just to get rid of them. And so I think landlord regulation would be great as well, or just some kind of training, anything at all.
I think that's a great point to end on. Thank you so much to the panel. Thank you all for being here, and hope you have a great rest of your day.